Now, today marks day one of the 2024 academic year. It kicks off with some challenges to the schooling year ahead. In fact, all public schools across the country will now start and end their school terms on the same dates. In previous years, you might remember, schools in coastal provinces started at a different time than their inland counterparts. Let's take a closer look at perhaps some of the things we should be thinking about as we begin the 2024 academic year. Head of the Department for Education and Curriculum Studies at the University of Johannesburg is Dr. Nazreen, who joins us now via our video link for this conversation. Dr. Dasoo, it's great to have you in the program. Thanks very much indeed for making time. You know, in the higher education space, there's always questions about a skills mismatch. Are we preparing people at that level for the world of work? But I think similar questions can be asked at a schooling level, right? Is the curriculum geared correctly enough to enabling pupils to flourish, quite frankly, once they make it out of this phase of their schooling years?
Good morning, Ayanda, and thank you for the invitation to be on your program this morning. Indeed. So if we look back at 2023, we were recovering from COVID. Schools were trying to take lessons away from what they had learned. What was the positive experience in terms of learning? Hybrid learning seems to have been a new kind of trend in education. But the big thing for us in 2023 at school level was the Pearls report, and unfortunately the disturbing result that 81% of our grade 4s or 10-year-olds are unable to read for understanding or for comprehension as we know it. So if we look towards 2024, then I think education at school level and of course at higher education level as well, at school level at least, we'll have to start addressing this Pearls report through various interventions, and I believe the DBE is trying to put those in place, such as teacher upskilling of teachers in this area, revising the curriculum policy regarding languages, obviously provisioning more resources to schools, and looking at the role of teacher education in the area of languages and how we can help in-service teachers start improving the way they teach this content at school level.
Yeah.
Of course, we're looking at the introduction of new subjects like robotics and coding at schools as well. But as you indicated before, and it's my humble opinion, that the challenges with the curriculum in terms of content relevancy, in terms of responsiveness, in terms of realignment, and in terms of addressing learner needs and learner diversity is still lacking. So, of course, we need to rethink our curriculum. Are we training teachers to be able to train Generation Alpha? I have a PhD student who's just completed a fabulous study on what teacher education is doing towards training the Generation Alpha. And how are we looking at a curriculum that serves the need for the 21st century and the 21st century employer, the 21st century learner. And I do think we need to rethink our curriculum very carefully.
Sure, all very interesting. If I can come in there, Dr. Dasoo, you know, there's certainly a lot to be considered here, and you started off by helping us think around the effect of COVID-19 and ways through which, in many aspects, it's changed the world order, hasn't it? You know, we've certainly had to reimagine a lot of even what we do as journalists and how we conduct programs like this. It leads me to asking questions around pedagogy and whether or not this idea of there being a teacher in front of a classroom and pupils sitting behind a desk is the best way to go about whatever you define teaching and learning as. You know, and I appreciate that there's a lot of layers to that question, but hopefully you'll help us think through just some of the different ways, quite frankly, through which we can achieve the objective here, which is to ensure that the kids who walk out of the classroom are a whole lot more enlightened than they were when they walked in.
Yes, indeed. So, absolutely, the way we look at education has changed completely, and perhaps the pandemic, even though with all the the terribleness that it came with also started making us realize that education does not only happen with a teacher in front of a classroom. And we're seeing more and more that parents' involvement is getting so huge in education of their children. And there's an upsurge perhaps also of the concept of homeschooling. And on the other end is this concept of unschooling. So, education has various forms. And if we look at unschooling, this was a concept developed by John Holt in the 70s. And he thought about schooling as more of an informal learning method. So where learners learned naturally. They were not curriculum bound. They were not classroom bound. A huge amount of resources went into the teaching of this child, but in an environment where the learner was self-directed, where the parents' involvement was prominent, where the community, where the learner learned about things within a community. So on one hand, we have homeschooling. We have the homeschooling, and on the other extreme of that continuum, we have a concept called unschooling. And unschooling means removing the child from a totally schooled type of environment. It might sound radical, but it worked very well in the 70s. It is still a concept that if the resources are available in a family, that parents who are brave enough to try out this kind of schooling may succeed in developing a holistic child. Someone who has learned naturally, who's curious to learn, who has the resources available, not just from a textbook or just not from a teacher, but from a community, from technology, and is able to be a self-directed, problem-solving adult as they go into the world out there.
Fascinating.
So yes, indeed, we have learned a lot from COVID. It was, in a sense, an opportunity for us to start thinking about how we learn, how we teach, and how we prepare learners for the future of our, the future that we are faced with.
Absolutely. It's been very interesting to kind of track the debate in the public discourse around whether or not, given what's at stake, it makes moral sense to even commodify education, right? Look, at the higher education space, again, there's been all kinds of discussions about that in the fees and roads must fall movements. But I think there is a very interesting kind of reflective process that can be undertaken when we consider whose objective ultimately it is to educate a nation, given the fact that we all benefit from that. What are some of those ethical considerations even to be made? And I ask this question off the back of many parents really raising concerns about how expensive it is just to get a pupil looking the part, let alone getting them into a classroom where you'll be confident that they'll be able to essentially reach their full potential.
Yes, so if we're talking about funding, I believe, if we believe that education is an essential for everyone to succeed in life, then of course that is where we should be putting our funding. We have to realize that the cost of living is extremely high, that the inflation rate doesn't match up to the salaries that teachers earn or that parents earn. And of course, perhaps starting to think about how we teach in different ways, that we are not only classroom bound. We have the opportunity with the internet, with technology, to be able to teach in other ways and in other fashions, so that learning is achieved and that learning is relevant. So the other issue is about what knowledge is relevant and how is that knowledge that's relevant made accessible to a learner. So I think it's something that needs to be debated. It's something that needs to be tried out. that we start looking at all forms of learning and all forms of education and how those can be accessible to all children, so no child is left behind. Again, I think I'm sort of making sense here in a sense of what I'm saying in terms of accessibility, in terms of leveling the playing fields. Of course, all of these different modes of delivery of learning and teaching is expensive.
Right.
Even having a teacher in front of a group of learners is an expensive exercise. It doesn't mean that we now take away the responsibility of all of us, including government, including teacher training institutions, where we say we devolve the duty upon the parent alone. It's not fair. We all have to take a role in terms of the way we train teachers, in terms of the way we lobby for enough resources at schools, enough resources to be able to train good teachers. We have students who want to be teachers, but they struggle with the amount of money they receive from a funder to be able to even buy a meal sometimes.
Yeah.
So all of those things need to be taken cognizance of. We need to be able to help young people become dynamic teachers, to be able to serve our communities that we are faced with. And we need good schools. We need the infrastructure needs to be looked at. And then, of course, the curriculum. For me, the curriculum is at the heart of all of this. And if we're looking at the curriculum, we need to know, is the curriculum serving the needs of the 21st century learner?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are we sending out learners that are entrepreneurs, for instance, that you don't need, at this time of the year, when the matric results get announced, many students don't make it to higher education institutions. And that's not the end all and the be all of life. There are other avenues to be able to be useful in a community, in a society. There are other skills that you can learn that will make you very successful. If we look in the past, not everyone who was a success story had a degree, for instance.
Right.
So what we're saying is that we need to think about access to education, and also, does it mean you are only successful if you hold a degree?
Right, absolutely.
Of course not.
Yeah.
Of course not. There are other avenues for you to be successful.
Yeah.
And entrepreneurship is a very important thing that we need to start teaching from a very young age.
Right, absolutely. So many different considerations to be made. Thanks for helping us think through all of them, Dr. Nazreen Dasoo. We appreciate your time. Dr. Dasoo is the head of department with the Education and Curriculum Studies Department at the University of Johannesburg.